The Nobel laureate Elie Wiesel once said, "I never teach the same course twice."
Welcome to the A&P Professor, a few minutes to focus on teaching human anatomy and physiology with host Kevin Patton.
This episode includes several updates, and I chat again with Aaron Fry, this time regarding the Nazi Anatomists and their impact on anatomy education today. Hey there, before we get started today, I have a very important question to ask you, and that is, did you do your homework? You may recall in the last episode that I asked each of you to mention something about this podcast to at least one other colleague who teaches anatomy and physiology, whether that's by email or a face-to-face conversation or a phone call or Twitter or Facebook or Instagram or whatever. By doing that, by spreading the word and increasing the total network of listeners that we have, the more questions we're going to get and the more feedback we're going to get and the more helpful this podcast becomes to everyone. So if you didn't do it, that's okay. I'm really lenient with podcast homework. And so you got another couple of weeks before the next episode to reach out to at least one other colleague and let them know something about the podcast that they might find helpful. And speaking of that useful kind of feedback, in the last episode, I was talking about why this podcast is a little louder in volume than maybe some of the other podcasts that you listen to. And I mentioned that one of the advantages is that people with hearing impairments, like I have, it allows us to turn it up a little bit louder, whereas if it's recorded at a lower volume, there's a limit to how loud we can turn it up, and we might not really be able to hear the entire episode. And so I got some feedback from a friend of mine, Ron Parente, who wanted to discuss this, and I didn't realize that he also has a moderate hearing impairment, and like me, he also wears hearing aids. And so that led to a discussion of, well, how do we as teachers with some impairment or some challenge, how do we deal with that in the classroom, and how do we work that with students and so on? And that kind of led to a conversation about how we deal with challenges that our own students have. Then that led to the idea that every time that we build in accommodations, for example, for the hearing impaired, in all of my teaching materials, or at least most of my teaching materials, I have transcripts or captions so that if I do have a student who is hearing impaired, there's no extra work I need to do to make sure that student is accessible. But what I found out is that all of my students benefit from that. They all are able to use those transcripts and captions. And sometimes even if a person's hearing is really good, those extra little helps really help a student learn. There's something that came up in another previous episode called dual coding, where we see something and hear something and read something, along with it, that can help our brain really absorb the content of what it is that we're watching by also hearing it and also reading about it. So this is a topic that I think is a very important one for any teacher, including A&P teachers. And so it's going to be the subject of future episodes. But in the meantime, I strongly recommend that you read a blog article written by Barbara Hurd at the HAPS blog, and I'll have a link to this in the show notes and at the episode page at the approfessor.org. It's entitled, "Would You Be Ready?" And it's talking about preparing our course materials for the potential that we will have students that need accommodations. So do take a look at that. And this is a good opportunity to invite your feedback ahead of time so that when I'm ready to do that episode, you've already sent in your questions, your comments, maybe some stories that you have about making our course materials accessible. And you can send those to me at podcast@theapprofessor.org, or even better, call in 1-833-LIONDEN, that's LIONDEN, or numerically, it's 1-833-546-6336. You also have heard me talk about HAPS a lot in this podcast. HAPS is the Human Anatomy and Physiology Society, and I've been an active member of HAPS for, over 30 years. Oh my gosh, can I be old enough to do? Yes, I am old enough to have done that. And I have not regretted any moment I spent in a HAPS meeting, in reading the HAPS Educator, in following the HAPS Twitter feed, or any of that stuff. There are just too many things to list here. And I recommend you go to hapsweb.org and check out the many programs and resources and so on that they have. And I'm very happy to announce that beginning with this episode, HAPS is now supporting this podcast. So whenever you run into Peter English, the executive director, or Brittany Roberts in our main office, or any of the officers or members of HAPS, mention to them that you appreciate the fact that they're helping keep this podcast going. So again, it's hapsweb.org. And on Twitter, it's at human A&PSOC. And I'll have the link to that in the show notes and on the episode page at theapprofessor.org. In my A&P course, I usually spend at least a little bit of time talking about epigenetic inheritance. When we're talking about the role of DNA and genes and why protein synthesis is important in terms of translating that genetic code and putting into play the various biological characteristics that we have as being offspring of our parents. When that comes up, I also talk about the fact that we now know that that classic sort of genetic inheritance is accompanied by this epigenetic type of inheritance where chemical markers, chemical additions onto the DNA can be formed during the lifetime of a parent due to various environmental conditions or other biological processes that alter these chemicals that are attached to DNA. And they can be passed along to the offspring, and when they are, they can affect the biological traits of the offspring. So in a way, it's passing along an acquired trait. Of course, there are limits to what can be passed along and how much can be passed along, but it happens. We know that. We've demonstrated that already in the research. However, we're still in the stage of working out exactly how that works. It seems pretty clear that changes in the methyl groups that are attached to DNA has an epigenetic effect. That process is called methylation, and that can be affected by some of these environmental conditions and other biological conditions that create changes in a parent, and they can have an effect in the offspring. And it's been very clear how this works being passed along from the maternal side, but on the paternal side, the evidence isn't quite so clear. But we're starting to work that out. And in a recent article that was published in a journal called Molecular Psychiatry, we see an example of some evidence that supports the idea that RNAs can be involved in epigenetic inheritance. And I think we've already worked out that the short RNAs are involved, but it's never really been those. By the way, the short RNAs are those with fewer than 200 nucleotides in their sequence. And now we can see that it looks like long RNA molecules, those with more than 200 nucleotides, can also be involved in epigenetic inheritance. And in this particular case, what they found was important because it was long RNA that was being passed along by the father and not just the mother. And so now we have some explanation for how paternal epigenetic inheritance can occur. And so I have the links in the show notes and on the episode page at theapprofessor.org if you want to look into this more. But It's another little tidbit we can add to our story and also emphasize the fact that this is a part of the story that is far from being worked out completely. There's a concept in biology called handedness, and that comes from the idea that among humans, we tend to either favor our left hand or our right hand. So, for example, I'm right-handed, although I've had more than one teacher tell me that I'm ambidextrous, which is supposed to mean you can use your left and right equally well. But in my case, they were implying that I can't use either my left hand or my right hand very well or very skillfully. But setting that aside for the moment, I want to talk about this idea of handedness because it also is used to describe the mirror image structures and even behaviors that we see all the way down to the molecular level. In chemistry, you probably recall talking about the chirality of molecules, where you can have a left-handed or right-handed version, or even cells. Now, I don't remember ever running across this with cells, but cells have handedness too. And that helps them fit together like puzzle pieces when they're forming membranes, for example. And it's an important example because that's what I want to talk about for just a minute. And that is some new research that has come out, and it was published in the journal Science Advances. And it talks about an enzyme that gets activated in diabetes that it turns out, they found, it affects the handedness of the endothelial cells that form the wall or part of the wall of our blood vessels. And if they all have the same handedness, they fit together in a certain way. But if this enzyme is activated, they can actually change their handedness, or at least some of them do change their handedness. And so now some of the cells don't fit together as precisely as they would have otherwise. And so now all of these tightly fitting endothelial cells, which are forming a very important functional barrier between the blood and the tissues, is now disrupted because you have these regions of the wrong-handedness. Whether they started out so-called left-handed or right-handed, they've now switched, and they're different than the other cells surrounding them, and so they don't fit together as well, and they make the cells leaky. And that adds to the various other mechanisms that are going on in diabetes that disrupts a lot of the different functions of the body. So there you go. Our cells are either left-handed or right-handed. I didn't know that. Now I do. Hey, don't forget that every episode of the A&P Professor podcast has a searchable transcript that makes it really easy to find something that you heard in a previous episode but weren't quite sure where it was. And we also have captioned audiograms. And that transcripting and captioning is supported through the American Association of Anatomists, AAA. You can find them at anatomy.org or on Twitter at @anatomymeeting. The featured segment of this episode is the second of two chats I had with my friend Aaron Fried. Aaron is an assistant professor of anatomy and physiology at Mohawk Valley Community College in upstate New York. Besides a lot of experience teaching A&P, instructional design, and teaching methods, Aaron is dedicated to the use of human donor dissection and human and animal tissues for learning and instruction, and is a national speaker on the history of body donation, specializing in the history of body use in Nazi Germany. In episode 29, we talked about some issues surrounding human body donors, which Aaron likes to call silent teachers. In this episode, we talk about what he's learned about some of the Nazi anatomists and how that directly impacts A&P teachers today. Well, we're here once again with Aaron Fried, who's been talking to us in the previous episode about the attitudes that we have in using human donors. And we learned about why he doesn't like to use the term cadaver, and some of the various issues of having respect for the human people, the real human people who have donated their remains so that we can use it for anatomy education, and even in derivative ways, such as in various replicas and models, and even the drawings that we see in anatomy atlases. And Aaron, I know you've done a lot of research on a series of anatomical drawings done by Edward Pernkopf and some of his colleagues, and they're still found in anatomy atlases today. So what's the story behind those illustrations, and why is that story important for A&P teachers like me to understand?
Kevin, you've opened Pandora's box, because once you ask me questions like this, sometimes it's hard to get me to stop talking. But
well, I have the recording switch at my end, so
yeah, right. You cut me off if you need to.
Okay.
So before I talk about Pernkopf, I think kind of a generic intro to this is I've been lucky enough to work with human donors for a long period of time. And I think part of studying Nazi anatomists is why I prefer the term human donor. We use that here at Mohawk Valley Community College because we're really trying to emphasize a choice, a decision that individuals made. And I think probably 6 or 7 or 8 years ago, when I started studying the Nazi anatomists, I read an article at the time. It's an Emily Bazelon article that was written. It was an online magazine. It was about a Senator, Todd Aiken, who made a claim about rape, where women who are legitimately raped have a mechanism to shut that down. And the interesting part of the article to me, other than that absolutely not being true, is that research actually comes from a kind of handed down set of citations from a Nazi anatomist named Handedness, who during World War II, under Nazi power, was doing research on the female menstrual cycle. And essentially what he was able to gain access to during that time was he was able to gain access to these individuals who were being executed by the Nazis. And he was able to gain these fresh tissues. The problem, if you have any experience with human donors, the problem is that the age of donation is usually very much in the top ages for humans. I mean, in our lab right now, we have a 96-year-old female donor and we have an 89-year-old female donor. And so if we want to study kind of normal reproductive systems, you don't get to see that. As an interesting aside to that story, I had expected that I was going to go into this studying the Nazis and find out all sorts of information about horrible things that were happening in concentration camps. But what I found out is that, picture that these Nazi anatomists are working under kind of a eugenics model. And so the people in the concentration camps are essentially lesser humans. They're not the most powerful traits in the population, and so they wouldn't have used them for study. So these were actually executed German citizens. The women that Handedness was using were executed mainly for political dissidents. So essentially, they had political views that were the opposite of the Nazi Reich, and they were executed because of those beliefs. And anatomists found great benefit from being able to get those tissues and use those tissues for study. I think to get back to Pernkopf, Pernkopf's a slightly different story because Pernkopf is in Vienna, so that's Austria, and kind of after World War I, Austria is separated from the Germanic Empire. Still a lot of the same conditions in Germany, still fairly fascist regime before World War II. In around 1936 or 37, Hitler annexes Austria, and he says it's part of the German Reich again. At that time, Edward Pernkopf becomes the dean of the medical school. Not unlike a lot of other places in Germany at the time, a lot of progressive faculty are kicked out. And I think at the University of Vienna, that was upwards of like 70% of the faculty is kicked out just because they're Jewish or sympathizers or just dissenters in general. And so it creates this real kind of center of eugenic studies. And it put, Pernkopf kind of at the top as the dean, is in charge of, acquiring bodies for the medical school. And at the same time is also starting to put together a plan to create several atlases. And the original plan was, it was a big plan. They ended up publishing, before he died, I think 7 volumes of the atlas that were, each volume was revised over time, and they were very detailed drawings. I think one of the things that makes the books unique is that they brought in artists who were watercolor painters, but instead of just looking at dissected specimens, they worked with Pernkopf, who was an excellent dissector. And so they understood the anatomy, and they were able to very accurately capture 3-dimensional characteristics in their 2-dimensional paintings. And the one thing that Pernkopf really wanted away from normal is he urged the painters to use very vivid color. So these paintings are described as being very artistic. In fact, one of the reasons the atlases are sought after today is because people view them as kind of these controversial works of art. So where the book starts to become controversial is that during the war, just like Hermann Stieve, Pernkopf is able to gain access to a supply of people who were executed as prisoners of the German Reich. And again, a lot of these people were not capital murderers. These were individuals who just disagreed with the Reich and were executed for their beliefs and ended up being dissected at the University of Vienna. These atlases, so after Pernkopf dies, somewhere around the 1960s is when the publisher has some of Pernkopf's colleagues edit the books, and probably much to Pernkopf's dismay, they took out pages and pages of his text, and all that remained in the final publications were his artist's work. They whittled it down to 2 volumes that were published 3 times in English, that they were published in addition to German and English, they were published in Japanese, they were published in French, Spanish, they were published in Italian. They were published as inserts for medications. They were actually using these to sell pharmaceuticals to people in different languages as kind of like a professional development opportunity for physicians. And one of the things that people noticed is that the artists did things like sign these paintings with, it was common for people to sign the paintings in their artwork, but they were putting swastikas in their signatures, or they were putting the SS lightning bolts in their signatures. And it really wasn't until the 1990s. So the first edition of Pernkopf was published in 1938, 1939. First time anyone ever really started to raise kind of big questions was around the late 1980s, early 1990s. And it wasn't until then that people started to look into what was going on with these books.
Wow, yeah. I have a couple of books where there's some of those in there. And this is something that, I've talked about to my students before. At the beginning of anatomy and physiology, I have a little kind of an intro discussion of how we know what we know in anatomy and physiology. And with the anatomy, clearly it's dissection. That's the root of all that we know. But I talk about how, the history, the culture, the social setting of any one time sort of determines what kind of experimentation we do. And that operates today. There's all kinds of questions being raised in our society about what is appropriate or not appropriate to do in terms of research and education and so on. And we touched on some of that in the previous episode when we had our earlier discussion. But I did bring up this sort of thing, like, okay, there are known cases where there are obvious ethical questions about how this material was produced, and yet it's still in our material. It's, here's an atlas that has some of them in it. So my question for you, Aaron, is, do you use those atlases in your own teaching? Should we be using them in our own teaching? What's a good way to think about that given their history?
Yeah, so that's an interesting question. I think one of the things that brought me into studying Pernkopf in particular, and I think I've been hyper focused on Pernkopf for probably the last year. The problem came up as I'm studying 6 or 7 years ago. I'm thinking about these Nazi anatomists, and I'm reading about this Pernkopf Atlas controversy, and I come across this one reference that says, "Oh, hey, by the way, these Pernkopf images are also in an atlas that was published in the U.S. by Carmine Clemente." I'm like, "Wait, what? We have that in our lab. I've been, talking about these Nazis for 2 years. We have these in our lab." And I went into the lab the next morning, and started flipping through the book, and I was like, "Oh, that is totally one of the images, one of the author's signatures." And right there in one of the editions of the Clemente Atlas was the signature where one of the swastikas had been erased. So it had been doctored so that it didn't look like that was an issue. So I spent a lot of time digging into Pernkopf within the last year. So I want to say last fall, I was invited by our colleague, Mark Nielsen, who has a great dissection program out at the University of Utah, to give my Nazi anatomy talk. And I mentioned, Carmine Clemente, these images are in his book. By the way, there's a whole series of atlases by another German anatomist, Sabata, who the same art has been pulled into those books. Someone sent me an image from one of the most recent versions of Gray's Anatomy, where one of the images is in there from one of those artists. I mean, these images kind of have worked their way into a series of different books. So as I'm talking about Pernkopf and the connection to Clemente and that it's in our lab, one of Mark's students raises his hands and he says, "Well, what do you do about those atlases?" And I kind of took a deep gulp and I said, I've had these atlases in our lab for the last 7 years, and I don't know. I don't know what we should do about them. It's a very difficult to me decision. First off, I'm not an ethicist. I'm an anatomist. I think of ethical questions all the time. But, so how do I solve this problem? I spent probably the first couple of months making appointments and going to, it was kind of my tour of Ivy League schools near me. I went to Yale, and I saw some of the original editions. I went to, I've been to Harvard, been to Johns Hopkins, just trying to look at what these books looked like, see if there's any clues in there, reading everything I could. And, so I actually I have a collection of the Pernkopf atlases in my office. We still use the Clemente atlases. Around the same time, though, I read some work by a woman, Sabine Hildebrandt, who she's an anatomy professor. She actually became an MD in Germany. She taught in Michigan for a while and now is at Harvard. She has a big emphasis studying these Nazi anatomists. And it just, one day out of the blue, sent her an email and said, can I come and talk to you about this? I have some questions that you might be able to answer, or at least point me in the right direction. And she said she would absolutely love to talk to me, but said, you need to look this over. She had been working with ethicists and rabbis and clergy to try and figure out, is it possible that we can figure out what to do with, I think the big problem that they started with was, they're trying to figure out what can we do with these books, or, they over in Germany, for example, if they're digging for anything new, they come across these graves. What do we do with these discovered remains? So there's this very specific protocol they developed called the Vienna Protocol, and in there's a recommendation about Pernkopf, and it's long, and it kind of goes on to say, well, the people probably wouldn't have consented to display of their body, but in this case, because things have already been done. And, it kind of goes on to say, if you use this with people who are going to use their training to do better in the world, and if you use the idea of exposing what Pernkopf did and using that as a way to talk about ethics and how not just being a good medical professional doesn't just mean doing good work, in your profession, but also making good ethical choices. That there's a path to using these materials as long as you acknowledge. And so what we've done is we had a big ceremony last semester where we did a talk on campus about Pernkopf. We created a plaque that acknowledges that we're not getting rid of the materials, because getting rid of the materials is something that the Nazis stood for, and we don't stand for that censorship. And so essentially, we acknowledge, and we have a plaque outside of our donor lab that says on the way in, we acknowledge that this has happened. We can't undo it. The best thing we can do is kind of learn from it, and going forward, make our promise to do as good as we can going forward. So, we use the materials, but we try to acknowledge what they are and, work with them.
I wonder if by acknowledging that and making people aware of, it doesn't make them, more informed that things like this have happened in the history of the world, and, maybe can sort of stand as a warning to not let it happen again. I know, I have those thoughts when I think about the history of these things, is that it's important to know about them so that we don't repeat that again.
Yeah, it's not. My guess is it's not the last time it's going to happen. I mean, even if you look at the story of Henrietta Lacks, that's a very much more contemporary example of a woman who her cells were harvested. She thought for just a routine medical procedure, but they were kept alive. And people, not only did they end up coming up with good medical treatments, but people made money off of that. And, there's kind of this conscious effort that I think, especially as anatomists, we have to make to do better than maybe a normal person would. I have lots of friends who are academics, and I talk to them about this, and they, people will say to me, well, these people are already dead. It doesn't maybe necessarily doesn't necessarily mean that you shouldn't use them. They're already there. And I say, we owe a better debt to the people who make conscious donation, that we understand and recognize that we have to be better. So
that's a great point. Aaron, I've really enjoyed this conversation. It's a fascinating story with these illustrations and the history behind them. And I think it brings up some important points, and I really appreciate you sharing your perspective on those.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Kevin. I'll make sure that I get you the link to my website, and I'll put some materials up. I know it's tough to talk about visual stuff and not be able to actually point to them, but I'll get some of that stuff up there so that if your listeners are interested, they can see some of the stuff we're talking about, but especially the plaque. I think that's kind of an important message. So yeah, I'm always interested to talk about this stuff. So.
Okay, great. Well, I've already talked to Aaron before we chatted today about him coming on the podcast again in the near future. So look forward to that. And I will have a link to Aaron's website in the show notes for the podcast, and also on the episode page at the approfessor.org. But in the meantime, go ahead and give us a call at 1-833-LIONDEN, that's LIONDEN, or 1-833-546-6336, or send an email at podcast@theapprofessor.org, and give us your reaction to what Aaron's been talking about, or maybe share some additional information or perspectives or resources that we can link to. Aaron, again, thank you very much.
All right. Thanks, Kevin.
I have some links to Aaron's website and Instagram in the show notes and at the episode page at theapprofessor.org. Aaron is available for speaking engagements anywhere, so feel free to contact him using that information. And don't forget, you have homework due for next time.
The A&P Professor is hosted by Kevin Patton, professor, blogger, and textbook author in human anatomy and physiology.
Warning, the contents of this episode may be hot.